Hey, magic class! Are you ready to learn more details about divination? Ready or not, here it is. If you're not, you can pause this. Let's start with the basics. Divination was not separated very much from religion in Greco-Roman culture. And this is true of non-Greco-Roman Mediterranean culture too. Divination for most religions of the Mediterranean was something that they would have thought of as more religious than magical. One of the reasons why modern American college students may not be used to thinking about it this way is because there is one religion in the ancient Mediterranean that eschewed most forms of divination, and that was Judaism. This was carried over into Christianity, and the early church made a big point of deliberately rejecting anything that smacked of divination, both for reasons that had to do with Jewish law and custom, but also because they were trying to separate hard from the religious traditions of the people around them in their communities. So combining divination with prayer, for a lot of them, felt a little bit too much like the religious tradition they were trying to distance themselves from. But as we talked about on Monday, this doesn't mean that Judaism and Christianity had nothing that could qualify as divination. In fact, there are kinds of divination that remain in Christianity and still pop up in different segments of practicing Christian populations, in the same way that different parts of Christian communities react to head covering or what's the role of imagery? Like, do we have pictures of saints or do we not? Do we put Jesus on the cross or not? Do we not have icons? Do we, yes, have icons? So this is still something that's quite variable. But in the ancient world, it would have been considered really unusual not to engage in divination. Not necessarily unusual to have divination skepticism. There's quite a lot of that floating around. So let's move on then to the hows, the kind of the physical steps and the different forms that divination could take. For all of these, purity was an important part of the preparation and the logic behind it. There was an idea that you had to be clean physically and or emotionally or spiritually in order to get answers from the divine. And that logic makes perfect sense. If the divine is special and powerful and free from certain things, then it won't want to reach out and touch you if you are contaminated by the kind of stuff that the divine doesn't like. So there was this idea that in order to be a vessel for the divine, you yourself had to be holy and possibly also protected. We'll get into the protection on the next slide. The way this would be done involved water bathing. That's the most common thing you see in these rituals. So either washing your hands or dipping your body into a sacred body of water. We're looking at one such body of water here. This is the Castalian spring at the shrine of Apollo at Delphi. And this was what the Pythia bathed in. And if you were coming to consult the oracle, you might also wash ritually in the water before going into the sacred space. Sacred space was often walled off from non-sacred space. The ground was hallowed so that you couldn't. Let's go about it another way. It was marked as special, and there were certain things you avoided doing to keep it special. For instance, no murder in the temple ground, no rape in the temple ground, no bleeding on the temple ground unless you're a sacrificial animal. This includes having babies. You can't go have a baby in a temple space. You would think that you wouldn't need a rule against that, but since a lot of pregnant people went to pray on sacred ground, especially sacred ground that was associated with healing deities, there are a lot of stories of people who waddle really, really fast to get outside of the wall so they can go have their baby and not pollute the sacred space. Making the ground sacred again after it had been desecrated would have taken a lot of ritual and rigmarole, which is why, for those of you who play D&D, Hallow, the spell, takes 24 hours to cast. Yes. Let's see, other ways that you could ritually purify yourself might involve smoke bathing, although that's not quite so much of a thing, eating or drinking special foods. You might also say certain words or prayers. There might be special clothing that you put on. More about that next. Because you're not supposed to go into divination without some kind of protection. And the logic behind this is pretty polyvalent. That is, it works on a bunch of different levels. First, you don't want to be damaged by direct contact with the divine. And when you're calling a god, you want to make sure that the god doesn't hurt you. Gods, in their pure unvarnished form in ancient mythology, regularly hurt people. Dionysus's mom died because she asked to see Zeus in his true form, and his true form is a lightning bolt, and lightning bolts are not good for you. Yeah, that's awkward. The other reason that you might want to be protected is that when you're making contact with the divine, you're opening yourself, and that means you're open not just to the divine force you're trying to contact, but to other divine forces too. Now, even though daimones or demons in Greco-Roman religion aren't, say, always chaotic evil, right? They're not intrinsically good or bad. If you're familiar with jinn or genie in Arabic traditions, it's more like that. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, some of them are neutral, but they're divine, and that means they're not necessarily safe. And it's also very difficult to screen for the alignment of a daimon when you're in the process of summoning it to go live in your gut, say. So one of the things you can do to protect yourself from these kinds of influences, also the evil eye, let's not forget the evil eye. Yeah, other humans can curse you too. You might use a phylacterion, and here we're looking at two surviving phylacteria, is the plural, phylacterion singular. These are sacred words inscribed onto a piece of metal associated with purity and protection. So these are the two most common. We have gold and silver. Gold was considered the purest metal. It was shiny, it didn't look like other metals, it didn't tarnish, it doesn't corrode. So for that reason, gold was thought to be especially pure. And if you're trying to keep your soul from getting corroded by this process, then gold is, by the principle of similarity or sympathy, a really good choice of protective metal. And this is also why it's used in, say, Orphic ritual tablets. Silver is a good next best. It's not quite as expensive as gold, so this is your budget phylacterion. But it's still a precious metal. Silver does corrode, but not in a way that damages its integrity, so it'll turn like black on the surface that's in contact with the oxygen, but it's only a teeny layer. Silver lasts really well, so much so that you can still use modern polish on an ancient coin without damaging it if you're trying to restore to make it look nice. Another interesting thing about silver is that the tarnishing is a convenient property because in contact with water, silver has antimicrobial properties, so silver can act as a preservative, and it can also act as a wound cleaning agent. So if you're looking for a metal that has life-saving, life-giving properties, silver's great, especially like silver plus water. We're already doing water as part of our cleansing ritual, so lovely. Now the words are formulas of a prayer that's meant to be protective, and you can see on this silver tablet here, there's even this box shape. You see around the words on the inside. This is something that comes out of Egyptian religious inscriptions or hieroglyphics. You may be familiar if you went through an Egypt phase or are still in one. I never left mine. Egypt's cool. If you want to protect somebody's name when it's written out, you'd put this stylized rope around it or a cartouche, and that would protect the name, but it also marks it off as special sacred. So this text does a similar thing, where it's got a little title box with these triangle shapes on either side, here and here. So this is a specifically Greek answer to the cartouche, and it's a way of protecting in this case, I think it's the name of the user. This doesn't always show up, but it's something that's cool when you see it. A lot of the symbols on these are often not letters, but things called characteres. We'll talk about those more in week 3. So there are also special magic letters. We don't know what the heck they mean. They're magic. So you've got your phylacterion, you wear it usually rolled up, and that's why they look all ripply. They were rolled into a cylinder, and then you'd wear them like on a necklace as an amulet or on a bracelet. You could also have them rolled up into something that you nail onto your door. And this is where there's some crossover into Judaism too, where there you have pieces of scripture that are rolled up onto a piece of paper and then put into a mezuzah on your door. Now this isn't technically quite the same thing as a phylacterion. It's meant to be an interpretation of one of the commandments of Jewish scripture to put the words of God onto your doorposts. But it's an activity that reaches into the same kinds of protective ritual that we see here in the phylacterion. You use contagion to put this emblem of goodness in direct contact with something or someone that needs protecting, that is vulnerable in a scary pants world. So it's culturally similar enough that comparisons are pretty legit and valid. All right, so we've washed. We have our phylacterion. Let's go to the divination. Now, there are times and places where divination tends to show up. And these are about the times and places you'd expect to. This is when you're making big decisions. Now, for governments and communities, these big decisions are things like, do we go to war? When we go to war, should we fight this battle today? Should we fight it here? Do the gods favor this? Should we sign this treaty? Is this a good time for peace? Should we raise taxes? So any kind of big state question is going to be subject to prayers and some kind of divinatory ritual. In Greco-Roman polytheism, a prayer is very frequently, and in the case of public prayers in state religion, like almost always, part of a sacrificial ritual. So you're giving some kind of food or an animal to the god in exchange for this interaction. And this seems to be the case in private divination too. Now, you may not be sacrificing a literal animal every time you do this, but you might say, give up a piece of wine or promise the god a thing, or there might be words, but there's reciprocity at the base of this interaction. We are here looking at a modern artist's conception of a story that encapsulates a lot about public divination that I think is useful for us as we're considering public divination, and that is an incident out of Rome's first war with Carthage. So this is the First Punic War. A ship captain by the name of Publius Clodius Pulcher was sailing with his fleet when he spotted the Carthaginians, and he really, really wanted to sail them down and join battle. But he couldn't just do that. First, he had to consult the will of the gods, as was his right and responsibility as a public official. And on your flagship, you'd have a professional diviner, in this case, an augur, who was a specialist in bird behavior. And that professional would be on your boat as part of your religious support. So the chickens were given food, and you'd watch the chickens pecking, and the way that they pecked at the food would tell you things about what the gods wanted to let you know about the coming battle. In this case, the chickens take one look at the food and they're like, nope, not eating, nope, 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 nope. And if you've ever met a chicken, you know that that's unusual chicken behavior. So the augur, being a professional, turns to Admiral Publius and he's like, yeah, the chickens aren't eating. Going to battle today is a bad idea. Let's not. And then Publius Clodius is like, the Carthaginians are right there, dude. And then he picks up the cage full of chickens, chucks them over the side of his flagship, and screams, if they won't eat, let them drink. He should have listened to the chickens. He lost the battle. But this is a story Romans would tell each other about the power of divination and the need to check yourself before you wreck yourself. And also part of a tension underlying these divinatory rituals too is the gods won't always tell you what you want to hear. Sometimes they're going to tell you not to do something that seems like a no-brainer. And it takes a lot of sociocultural pressure to make sure that people stand by oracles. A lot of people didn't. And not everybody gets instant karma in the same way that Publius Clodius did in this story. It just goes to show you that Romans are people too. And Greeks and so on and so forth. Okay. Not every professional diviner has the luxury of a state-sponsored job with nice state-sponsored pay and food and stuff. But there's a huge market share out there for diviners in private practice. So here are some of the categories and names for these kinds of diviners. You'll find these guys in Ogden too. So the generic word for anybody who is a specialist in divination is a mantis. The plural is mantes, it's Greek. So a mantis, that root man is similar to the one that gives us mancy. Like erythromancy is magic with numbers. Or like necromancy is magic with dead people. You get the picture. So within this realm, we have onerocritai, which is what you guys have been spending some quality time with this cycle. These are interpreters of dreams. As Artemidorus explained to you, an oneros is a prophetic dream, a dream with special meaning, as opposed to an enhypnion, which is just a normal generic dream where you just like do normal awake person stuff, only you're asleep. Ornithoscopoi is bird omen readers, and the Latin version of this is an augur. I think I've got a slide with that word on it. If not, I'll put it up somewhere else. So ornithoscopoi is from the Greek word ornithos, like ornithology, and scopos, like a microscope, is where you look at micro things. So an ornithoscope, ornithoscopoi, singular is ornithoscopos, or ornithos. No, it's a compound, so you use os for both masculine and feminine, so I guess it's gender neutral. Yay. This is somebody who professionally bird watches. Like very literally, like you just sit and you watch bird behavior, and you go to a lot of training to do this. If you're a state-sponsored bird watcher, you'll go to a state-sponsored bird watching college, which is a professional association. So it's a little bit like a plumbers union, only for bird watching. If you're in private practice, you still may have had formal public training, but you'd also have to prove your bona fides by saying who you studied with and why you know what you know. You could lie about that, though. There's no central licensing agency for this. So buyer beware. Make sure you vet your ornithoscopos, is what I'm saying. Next up, kreismologoi. So these are people who don't read omens as they're happening. These are kind of the referees, or maybe even like the sports commentators of the omen world. So these are people who look at prophecies or omens or texts, and they try to make sense of them and get them to agree. And no wonder there's a whole profession for this in the ancient world, because can you imagine just how, like, it's hard enough to get a bunch of legal experts to agree on a legal interpretation of something. Like, ask the Supreme Court how easy this is, and that's just interpreting, like, a specifically rational and rules-based system. Now, imagine doing that with things oracles have said. Actually, sounds like a really fun job. If this professor gig doesn't work out and I change religions, maybe. So finally, we have Engastri, oh gosh, sorry, Engastri belly talkers. So N is in, gaster, like gastric bypass, is your belly, your tummy. Muthos is the same root that gives us myth. So these are things that tell stories from inside a belly, which is similar to so this isn't necessarily a ventriloquist so much as somebody who actually, no, this is pretty similar to ventriloquism in the ancient sense. So I've included a quote from Julius Caesar, the Shakespeare play that you may recognize. The guy who comes up to Julius Caesar is like, dude, beware the Ides of March. And Caesar's like, thanks, man, but no. And then Caesar gets stabbed. That dude who was like, beware the Ides of March, that was a Mantis. If a Mantis tells you to beware the Ides of March, stay home on March 15th. Just do it. Stabbing isn't fun. Maybe if you're doing... No, I don't think I'd enjoy actually stabbing anyone. It's sad. Oh boy. So on to our methods. Now, the overarching principle that informs these different modalities of omen interpretation is an idea called cosmic sympathy. So you guys are familiar with sympathy already. So this is the idea that the cosmos, the universe, because it's all a whole, the largest parts of the universe are inextricably connected to the smallest and vice versa. So that what goes on in the stars and the sky is intimately connected to what goes on in the smallest particle of your body. What goes on in the earth and between the elements is also relevant to you and your life. So if you start on that belief, right, that the universe is connected, the universe talks to each other, and what happens over here can be observed in something that happens over here, then you can posit that by observing over here, you can make assumptions about what's going on over here where you can't see. So let's think about things we can see in the natural world that we can look at and then interpret in order to look into our human blind spots, which is what we're trying to do with divination, right? We're trying to look to where we don't have eyes by extrapolating. So, divine meetings is a category Ogden goes into, and I'm not going to reiterate too much here, but dreams are one such area of contact between divine and mortals. So the dream state was felt to be a vulnerable state, one that the gods frequently interfere with, and one that, for people who believed in this cosmic sympathy idea, was ripe for interpretation. And even people who don't necessarily buy into cosmic sympathy still can be left at the end of a dream wondering, where the heck did that come from? I think even the most aspiringly rational among us has had a dream where you wake up like, what's going on with my teeth? We're like, why did Darth Vader kidnap my puppy? It's disturbing sometimes, the stuff that comes out of our dreams, and even more so because it's entirely in your head, right? So that, like, whatever that disturbing thing was that happened in your dream, seems to have come from you. So what does that say about us if our brain is making these things happen? And you'll notice some of the things Artemidorus focuses on are things that are super distressing when you dream about them. Things like incest, like that is a really creepy thing to dream about. That can, like, you know what? I will admit that I've had really disturbing incesty dreams that were like, what the heck? Where did that come from? And I'm just saying that in case it helps anyone. Like, I find it very telling that Artemidorus tries to kind of talk you down into making it not mean that, because that is such a disturbing thing to dream about. I love my family, but not like that. So, dreams. Dreams make sense as a place where you'd look for divine meaning and some kind of a metaphorical thing. Even just to give yourself resolution from the disturbing images that your brain just came up with. So next up, theurgic soustasis, which is a lot like a dream, just more literal. So this is either when a god appears to you in your dreams or speaking, or just in general. So this is a much more literal intervention that you might seek to get the god to come to you and talk to you or stand beside you. Also an experience where you feel the god is nearby and hanging out. So next up then is divine possessions. It's kind of the next step in this chain. Belly talkers fall into this, but it's not the only kind of divine possession construct in the ancient world. It was a part of regular religion writ large, including ancient Judaism. This belief that divine or semi-divine or supernatural powerful forces could step into and inhabit a human body, either partially or completely. And that this was something that could be either consensual or unwelcome. In some instances, there's an idea that there has to be some level of consent for it to work. In other cases, no, they believed in involuntary possession. So there are two large categories we can lump this into. Either a consensual, or not consensual, I guess, a divine possession in which no, I'm going to walk this back a little bit. There are two things you can choose to do about this kind of possession. Either you try to harness it and use it in order to gain special insight or divine knowledge, or you can evict the daimon. And procedures for both of this are part of what a Mantis might be doing. So you might be doing some casting out, you might also be doing some hostage negotiation, or you might be deliberately inviting these spirits into you for divinatory purposes. This was thought to be risky for reasons that a passing acquaintance with the horror genre should make pretty clear. There is a belief that you could start out with consensually invite-only consultations with your daimon, but over time the daimon could take over, eat your brain, or use you for nefarious purposes, etc., etc. Next up is necromancy. So within this we have a couple of categories. Necromancy involves several categories of activities meant to harness the power of dead people. And here we're not talking about raising people from the dead in the same way that we do necromancy in D&D. This is more like trying to talk to dead people and or trying to harness dead people and force them to do your will, which gets us to panhedros. So a panhedros is a Greek word for, it basically means a butler. And this is a dead person that you have bound to yourself to be your little ghost helper. And this was felt to be a super sketchy thing. Like, this isn't necessarily something that you would if you were dating somebody with a panhedros, you wouldn't bring that up when you first take them to meet your parents. Let's put it that way. Like, this may have been something that you brag about, but you brag about in sort of a sketchy, edgy kind of way. Like, yeah, I've enslaved a dead boy. The person that you want to enslave is the person with the maximum unused life potential, and this would have been a dead prepubescent male. But you might also try to go for a dead unmarried girl because she'd be super upset about not having gotten to get married, but I don't know, they seem to like boys better for reasons. Let's see, what else did I want to say about this? Yes, so sometimes you might also use a boy medium. So if you were worried that your ghost helper might revolt and possess you, which is a legit security concern, then you might get a boy to be your firewall. So you would make the boy the medium so that they would, you know, you'd get the magical power of that boy, but then also you'd get like the ghost, but then you wouldn't be risking as much because you'd be going through this medium. Just a depressing life, and I'm so sorry for. It's just not something you should be doing with your young children, I don't think. Okay, so let's look at some specifics here. So this is bowl divination. This one you'll recognize from Ogden 9. And normally if we were in class, I'd ask us to comment on this. We're not in class though, so pause for a minute and ask yourself, what's the logic behind what's going on here? And why are we picking these specific things in this specific culture? So we'll pause. 3, 2, 1. Wrong finger. So a couple observations people have made in the past. We've got 4 kinds of water, and they're tied to gods from a couple, well, at least 2 different pantheons, right? We've got Zeus and we've got Osiris, so we've got Greco-Roman and we've got Egyptian, no Greco-Roman. Osiris and Serapis are kind of sort of the same god. Serapis is the more Greek version of Osiris. You've got water from 4 different sources. You've got stuff from both below and the sky, so you've got all of the parts of the universe pulled together into this bowl. So we've got cosmic sympathy big time. When we use gods from different pantheons, that's an element of syncretism, and this was considered perfectly normal in ancient polytheism. So they didn't have a stay in your own lane rule where you could only do Roman gods or only do Greek gods. They thought not only was it fine to include gods from different pantheons, but they thought it was extra pious. In fact, if you weren't willing to address gods by the local name or take somebody else's gods into your pantheon and let them have yours, you could be charged with atheism in some parts of the ancient world. And this isn't, atheism meant both either not believing in the gods or not being willing to believe in other people's gods, which is an interesting head exploding moment for those of us who are used to modern American ways of looking at religion. So let's see. Notice that the olives are unripe, so we're taking olives before it's their time to die and squishing out their essence. So we're using the logic we use with human souls in our bowl procedure. And then we're putting oil on top of water in a bronze bowl, and a polished bronze bowl is going to make the water shiny, and it's going to create light patterns within the bowl, and then the floating oil on the top is also going to create these randomized patterns. And if we're going with a cognitive interpretation of this, human cognition likes to find patterns, right? Pattern recognition is one of the basic functions of a human brain. And one of the things we've found in studying human brains is that human brains work overtime to try to find patterns, especially face shapes. Human brains love to find faces because that's what we're programmed to do. Not all human brains, though. Some human brains don't do that, and that is face blindness. And there are differing degrees of it. I've got it a little bit, so I have some sympathy for this end of the cognitive spectrum. At any rate, so looking at these patterns scratches an itch in the human brain and also causes the human brain to associate and to try to recognize stuff, a little bit like a Rorschach blot test. So if we're going to be intellectualist about this divining process, then we could say that we're harnessing the power of the human mind's pattern recognition to try to advance our ability to recognize signs of natural patterns, which, fair enough. I think you can see it that way and still believe in it too, which interests me as well. So, all right, you've got all of your stuff, but you still have to do an invocation. And when you're done, you have to press the off button. And this is an important part of any of these rituals where you're inviting the divine for communication and then you have to make them go. Because if you don't press the off button, the god might just hang around and get a little too cozy with you and move into your liver. And then, you know, if you don't want to have some little god voice going, hello, from your belly, then it's an important safety consideration. Bowl divination has a long shadow in the way that modern people still think about divination, right? You've seen this kind of bowl divination, even if you didn't say, oh, look, bowl divination. We have here two of many examples. There's the mirror. Mirrors make a good proxy for bowls because especially pre-modern mirrors had like shadowy, weird, funky shapes in them. So you could use them for these rituals. Sometimes you'd have like mirror plus water to do this kind of thing. So the magic mirror in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is one example. And then also the mirror of Galadriel, which is not a mirror, but a bronze bowl full of water infused with the light of the star of Erendil. And then if you hold aloft Nenya, the adamant ring of water, you could also like contact the power of the one ring and then draw Sauron's attention, and like, don't do that. It's unsafe. Hi, Galadriel. She's cool. And now I'm going to introduce you to some seers of ancient mythology that show up in Ogden, because the myths about seers and prophets are really key to unpacking a little bit of what's going on with seers in real life in the ancient world, the kinds of things that people expected of them, the sorts of norms that ancient culture needed to enforce in order to keep seers safe and to make sure that they had a certain amount of job security. So I'm going to start in the middle of this list. This list is in roughly chronological order. So Tiresias is the oldest. He's from the generation before the Trojan War. Calchas is an older seer who's present during the Trojan Wars working for the Greeks. And Cassandra is a younger prophetess who's in Troy at the time of the Trojan War. Calchas is the template for the male Mantis, male seers. And he's the middle portrait here. So this fellow wearing this nice magenta and turquoise outfit with the wrap tied around his waist. This outfit is interesting for a few reasons. Note the closely fitted sleeves. That's typical of Persian dress. So they're dressing him a little bit like a magus here. It's a Roman mural, a time when the Magi were really influential in the Mediterranean, so it makes sense that that's where the artist would reach. But then also the way this garment is structured, so this is a draped tunic that's belted up really high on the body in a way that almost emphasizes Calchas's breasts. So this is the way that the god Apollo dresses. And Calchas was a seer of Apollo, so it makes sense he's cosplaying a little bit as Apollo. However, you can tell it's Calchas because he's got a beard and it's gray. Gods don't get gray beards. Apollo doesn't have a beard. Around his head, there's a wreath made out of greenery. Sometimes you'll see it with greenery and wool. In fact, you can see it on Cassandra here. She's got this tie around her head. That's part of a priest's or priestess's headgear, and it's also something that you'd wear when you were doing your divination ritual. So it's a way of marking yourself as a holy person in this culture. Interestingly, Calchas is holding not one but two stick-like things. This thing here might be either a horn, it might also be a pipe. We're not entirely sure what that is, though. In his right hand, this long pointy stick thing, this is his rhabdos, his wand. So he's got a literal magic wand. You can see Tiresias has a walking stick. That's a part of Tiresias's stuff, too. Calchas is a fellow whose plot service function in ancient mythology is to tell powerful people stuff they don't want to hear, and then get threatened almost immediately with death, only to be proven right. And he's still fine, though. I think what's going on with these myths is an enforcement of a really necessary social rule, because prophets in this culture have to tell powerful people to not do stuff they really want to do, or to do stuff they don't want to do, as the case may be. Speaking truth to power is dangerous, and speaking truth to power in a specialized field of knowledge that's really hard to explain, that doesn't have rules that are falsifiable or independently verifiable in many cases, is to inhabit a position of trust, but also a position of vulnerability. Calchas escapes this pretty well unscathed, go him, but a lot of real-world Mantis probably didn't. Likewise, Tiresias gets us a little bit closer to the dangers of prophecy, albeit in a mythological universe. Tiresias had a really interesting life with a lot of stuff to unpack here. Ogden mentions Tiresias a bit. I'm going to give you an overview of Tiresias's backstory because it's super interesting and nifty to think with. Tiresias was out walking in the countryside one day and was very young at this point in Tiresias's life. And Tiresias sees a couple of snakes mating in the middle of the road. He recognizes that one of these snakes is Zeus. Somehow, I don't know, maybe it's got like little lightning bolts zipping around it. And he realizes that the other snake is not Hera, so oh my gosh, Zeus is doing what Zeus does. Again, for those of you who don't know, Zeus rapes people. Also has consensual sex with, but most of the time it's rape. It's bad. So Tiresias goes down the road a bit and then he runs into Hera, and then he realizes he's got a choice to make. He can either side with Zeus or he can side with Hera and tell Hera what he just saw. So Hera's like, have you seen Zeus? And Tiresias makes a choice. Tiresias is like, yeah, I haven't seen Zeus. Technically true, he saw snakes, is what he saw. Hera then finds out that Tiresias lied. Zeus is able to slither away, but she knows she's a goddess. So she turns Tiresias from a male-bodied person into a female-bodied person. And then Tiresias proceeds to live in that female body as a woman for years. unspecified, but in many versions of the myth, Tiresias is in a female body long enough to have a child. And we do know, because of what happens next, that Tiresias was having sex with men in a female body. So for a while, Tiresias is living as a she. Eventually, though, Zeus remembers Tiresias and decides to help Tiresias out. It doesn't seem that Tiresias asked, which is interesting. So Zeus finds the snakes again. It's unclear whether it's Zeus and his girlfriend or just snakes. And he takes out his staff and then hits the mating snakes with it, and then is turned back into a male-bodied person. This is a version of the myth. There's also a version of the myth where he sees two random snakes mating, and he hits the two snakes mating, and boom, it turns him female-bodied. In some versions, Zeus and Hera are involved, in some not. Ancient mythology is variable that way. Later on, then, Zeus and Hera are having an argument, wherein Hera is claiming that men enjoy sex more, and Zeus is claiming that no, people in female bodies enjoy sex a lot more. And then they look at each other. You know who we can ask? Tiresias! So they get Tiresias over, poor Tiresias, and they ask Tiresias, hey, who enjoys sex more? People in male bodies or people in female bodies? And Tiresias is, really, there's no win in this situation. He says, actually, people in female bodies, technically speaking, this says more about what Tiresias experienced than what people in general experience, but this isn't a scientific story in any sense. So at this point, Hera is mad because she lost the argument. So she strikes Tiresias blind, which puts Zeus in a really difficult position, because if he reverses Hera's curse, then Hera's going to be mad, and this is just going to get everybody in more trouble. So he decides that he's going to give Tiresias the gift of prophecy in compensation. He's like, okay, so you can't see with your flesh eyeballs, but you can see with your spirit eyeballs really well now. And so Tiresias begins Tiresias's life as a wandering seer. He ends up in Thebes eventually. And he has as his helper and guide a young boy. So when you see Tiresias post-blindness in Greek mythology, he'll have a young boy with him to act as his guide, and possibly also as his boy medium. I guess Zeus has a really good compensation package. So that's Tiresias's backstory. And Tiresias is a bit more vulnerable than Calchas, possibly for reasons connected with Tiresias's gender fluidity and or enforced gender changes. It is not a question that ancient mythology spends much time thinking about, but that's the beauty of myth, is we can use it to think about things other than what ancient people were using it for. So Tiresias, however, does live a long life, and even after death, he's still giving prophecy. The scene we're looking at here is the hero Odysseus with his sacrifice here, talking to the souls of the dead in the underworld, including the dead seer Tiresias, who gives him a dead seer prophecy, which is some incredible job security, but I also wonder if Tiresias was happy about this. Finally, let's talk about Cassandra. She's not the only mythological seer, but in general, mythological seers in female bodies tend to have greater experiences of violence for reasons that are pretty easy to link to overall patterns in the ancient world. Cassandra is a particularly sad-making case, though, because she's one of many victims of Apollo's incredibly toxic dating habits. if I were up against a wall and had to pick which god had the most toxic dating habits, it would be Apollo, hands down. Because Apollo, many times, like this is a serial thing for him, he would go up to people he wanted to date, give them the gift of prophecy to try to make them have sex with him, and when they said no, he would then curse them. So they'd get prophecy and then something awful. One of his prospective partners uh, gets prophecy and she asks for eternal life, but not eternal youth, so she just keeps getting older and older. Just messed up, but not the only time this happens in Greek mythology. Cassandra, though, is cursed with never being believed. So she's a priestess of Apollo. She has the gift of true prophecy. Every prophecy she makes is the truth, and it's not even hidden behind ambiguous wording. It's like the literal truth. But nobody is capable of believing her, which is a specific kind of hell for Cassandra, because she is the daughter of the king of Troy during the Trojan War. So from the minute she has the gift of prophecy, she knows that her entire family is going to be killed one by one by one in war, sometimes right in front of her. She knows that her dad is going to get murdered, that her mother is going to lose all of her children, that eventually she herself is going to be a victim of sexual violence and kidnapping and human trafficking and sex slavery and eventually murder, as discussed in our previous lecture. So from the beginning of this, she knows exactly where her life is going, and she has to sit with that knowledge, and it eventually makes her, in some versions of the myth, she is insane. In other versions of the myth, people just think she's insane. Quite frankly, I think how it would, I'd worry about somebody's mental stability if they weren't made unstable by that kind of psychological torture. It's horrifying. But Cassandra is also part of this mix, because in her, we have a bit of a warning, not for people not to kill prophets, although that's part of the Cassandra story, but also a warning for prophets. Like, do you really want prophecy? Do you? Because prophecy doesn't give you peace. It doesn't give you security. It doesn't give you any kind of emotional protection. Like, you think it would be nice to know what's going to happen to everybody. But think for a minute, like, if your past self knew, say, that 2020 was coming, how would you deal with that? What would it be like to watch everybody around you make decisions that end up leading us to where we are now? As an ancient historian, I kind of feel like that already. But it's one of the things that I find really compelling about Cassandra's story, as much as I find it really heartbreakingly sad. It's not a story I feel like I want to obsess over, but it's also one that I find, I don't know, weirdly validating, because, yeah, too much knowledge is painful. And that's a useful thing to have in your mind, that if you're pained by watching people make bad decisions, that's understandable. Cassandra gets you. And in that, I do find some kinship and some happiness and solace, which is, I think, why I have love for Cassandra, even though I find her story just horrifying and depressing. Cassandra, I would like to hang out with you. I would try really hard to believe you. Okay, let's talk a little bit about social class. We've talked about gender, we've talked about state sponsorship, but we need to talk a little bit about how your access to wealth and privilege influences the kind of career you might have as a real-world Mantis. If you're high status, then you're one of the people who's going to be recruited into state-sponsored priesthoods. So you might end up on the ship with Publius Clodius Pulcher and his ill-fated chickens, which is not a place I would want to be as a working professional. You might end up marching with the army, reading entrails before major battles, or you might end up with a cushy job in central Rome until the emperor decides to throw you to the arena or something. High status doesn't necessarily mean you're insulated from danger, but it does mean that this echelon of Mantis wouldn't be worried about food security, say, or their ability to pay for rent. Probably their family would own houses that they themselves were renting out to other people. If you were low status, you wouldn't be put into one of these priestly colleges. This is entirely restricted to people from wealthy families. And if you ask them, like, do you deliberately select people from wealthy families? They'd be like, oh no, of course not. The gods just somehow keep picking people from upper class families. If you were from a lower socioeconomic status, though, in some ways you did have certain insulations. Now, food insecurity would have been back on the table. Housing insecurity seems to have been a thing. In fact, there are some social norms that indicate that wandering around, sort of chronic homelessness, was something you look for in a seer. It's at least normalized. It's possible that people wouldn't trust a seer who didn't look at least a little bit homeless. In the myths, Tiresias is homeless. Cassandra becomes homeless eventually. Of course, she's higher as socioeconomic status. Tiresias is ambiguous. Anything else I want to say about this? Likely, this was both a curse and a blessing for seers, in that if they had to speak truth to power, they were sacrosanct enough that they would have been hard to beat up in an alley. Like, even if you tried to hire the mob, or like crime families, which was a thing in the ancient Mediterranean. Romans invented the mafia. Not invented, at least codified. They'd likely hesitate a bit before beating up a seer. Like, you don't want to do that because their gods like them. Likewise, seers would have gotten fed and perhaps housed by people in the area, so like there's homelessness, but it's kind of a couch surfing sort of homelessness in many instances. There are some theories, and this is unfortunately something we can't prove without time travel because retrospective psychological diagnosis is impossible, but this may have been something that people with mental illnesses in the ancient world would have found as a niche economically. It may have been a way of including and supporting people experiencing mental illness as still part of society in a way that was affirming rather than othering. From a disability studies and inclusivity standpoint, I think that's an interesting thing to sit with. I am not, however, suggesting that this is a solution to the vast overrepresentation of the mentally ill and homeless populations. Seriously, guys, we can do better. This shouldn't be a recognizable social feature from 2,000 years ago, is all I'm saying. Okay, so a few last notes about kinds of divination. We haven't talked yet about entrails. Let's talk about entrails. A regular thing that you would do when there was an animal sacrifice as part of a religious ritual, either private or state-sponsored, was to open up the animal that you had just sacrificed and look for irregularities in the organs. Since these animals had to be ritually perfect, so no spots, no blemishes, no sign of disease, young, in good health, even specific kinds of fur patterns were necessary. For instance, if you were sacrificing to a chthonic deity, often it had to be a purely black animal. Once you had ritually sacrifice that animal to the god, then you would open the entrails, and if you saw irregularities on the entrails, then, sorry, spouse just got home, let me open the door.
You mean I can make all kinds of noise?
Yes, you can. Welcome home, Mr. Spouse. Let's talk about entrails. So after you make your sacrifice and disembowel the victim, when you find signs of disease in the entrails, this was thought to be divine intervention because this was a healthy animal. There's no natural reason that stuff should be wrong on the innards. So things like spots or irregularities on the surface of the liver, weird kinks of the intestine, tumors, stuff like that is a sign that needs to be read by a professional. But if you need a quick start guide to hubris and you read Etruscan, you're in luck. This is the liver of Piacenza. This was a diagram for people learning how to read livers. This is a sheep's liver. We can tell from the lobe patterns. It's like a sheep's liver looking from the bottom of the sheep up into the diaphragm. And here there's a little moon signs, and we think like these might have something to do with like the sky or the moon, or we don't know. There are a lot of speculations, but this gives you an idea of what this looked like. So the word for this kind of divination is haruspiki. A person who does it is a haruspex. This is that Etruscan liver scope. Sorry, that's on the slide, isn't it? And this was something that you could have as your nice, cushy government job, is all day, every day reading entrails. After you had read the entrails, you would burn them up with the fat and the bones of the sacrificial animal on an altar, but the meat itself would be sold. And public sacrifices were a regular source of safe meat in urban spaces because these animals were deliberately selected to be healthy. Oh, that reminds me. Mr. Spouse, the rice is bad.
I know.
Okay, good.
I can smell it.
Okay, yeah, little kitty ate some and got sick. Oh, I should have pressed pause. Well, now you guys know that there's bad chicken on our stove.
Rice was bad!
Something I would have known had I consulted the oven oracle. Yes. Mr. Spouse has read the chicken entrails better than I did. So, yes, this is the slide that has the word augur on it. Bird and sky omens are indeed something you read in Rome. The Roman word for this is an augur. Auguries are the omens, or just the practice of observing both the birds, but also weather and star motions are also part of this. And this was a part of the Roman government. And there's this funny story about this. When Julius Caesar was consul, his co-consul Bibulus, as a political protest, used his right as co-consul to go watch the heavens for signs. And every day, the heavens said to Bibulus, hey, no public business. And Caesar was like, this is the ancient version of a filibuster. So Julius Caesar is like, you can't tell Caesar to stop doing stuff. So he passed a bunch of legislation that was technically illegal, but there you go. So you could use augury and watching for auspicia, right, watching the sacred chickens, as a filibuster tactic in ancient governments. So down here you can see an augur. This is the special stick that augurs carried, so you know they're an augur. And everybody consulting the sacred chickens has their head covered. This is an important part. So the head covering is both a sign that you are in sacred space, but it's also meant to block out you seeing anything that you shouldn't be seeing, because anything that happens while you're taking the auguries is relevant. So like if out of the corner of your eye you see, I don't know, a chicken explode, or a statue fall over, or your cat pees on something, that is now part of the omen. But if you don't see it, it doesn't happen for the omen. So by putting on toga blinders, you're limiting the stuff you can see. It was also meant to give you concentration for the rite, because if you mess up any part of this rite, you have to stop and start all over again, possibly with new chickens. and that could rapidly get expensive. So for all of these reasons, when you take your auguries, make sure you cover your head. Finally, oh, turkey, yay. Good, Mr. South spot us a turkey. I'll let you know what was inside of the turkey later. There are prodigia, which are omens taken from stuff that happens that's weird. And this includes both stuff that is like National Enquirer, Weekly World News kind of stuff, but also things like solar and lunar eclipses or conjunctions of planets. So this is both unusual stuff that is predictable using ancient science, at least the cutting edge of ancient science, but stuff that's like weird and off-putting and a little creepy too. Or it can be stuff that we are almost sure absolutely did not happen. Like some examples of prodigia taken from Pliny the Elder include a woman giving birth to an elephant, a woman giving birth to a bunch of snakes, a baby that's like born and then immediately turns around and crawls back up into the uterus. Never happened. God, I hope that didn't happen at least. So, let's see, other things that are prodigia. So rivers flowing backwards, which is something that does happen on occasion, often in conjunction with like an earthquake. So if that happens, it's bad. An intellectualist might look at this and be like, oh, okay, so this is like an early form of scientific observation where they're just like noting stuff to research later. And indeed, prodigia do fill that function. In fact, in natural science, one of the reasons we still reach for Pliny is because stuff Pliny records as prodigia are now explainable natural phenomena. And to Pliny the Elder, he also thinks that they are natural phenomena. His book was a compendium to the state of natural sciences in his time. And you can get some of that with what Pliny says about the Magi, right? Pliny thinks they are the worst. He's also really interested in them, but he thinks that they're bad, it's superstitious, it's all bunk. But he also is like, yeah, but that thing where the baby crawled back in the womb, it's in the Roman Augurs book, so I guess that happened. And it's not because he's credulous or not a thinker. Like, Pliny the Elder is trying really hard to be rational, but that line between weird scientific phenomenon and thing that didn't happen is not particularly well defined in this stage of science. So Pliny the Elder himself struggles with where to put that line. There are passages in his book where he's like, so like, where do we call out superstition and where do we say, oh, this is just a science thing we don't understand yet? His word for it is like philosophia, which to him means a loving of wisdom or a love of understanding the world. Which is all to say that you can, if there's something that will catch a human eye in the ancient world, you can bet your britches that somebody used it to read some kind of omen at some point. And the location of power and knowledge here, and who gets to say which omens are legit and which aren't, even though the mechanisms for centralizing that are there, right? There are colleges of priests who keep omens that Pliny's leaning on as kind of his touchstone for like, okay, this is a legit observation, this is not. There are just as many people in the ancient world who decentralize that knowledge, who are willing to believe in a wider world of divine encounters. It's a world that's alive in every part, where the gods are reaching out to talk to us, where we should be either flattered or scared or both of that kind of attention. And yeah, so that's what I have to say about that. I hope that makes sense of what's going on in Ogden. And this is something worth keeping in the back of your mind as we go into our next topic, attempts by the Roman legal system to control magic as part of their legal system. Because this is a system where not all magical activity is illegal, but some is. So the question of like, why is some stuff acceptable and some stuff not, is one that I think is revealing and interesting. So that's it. See you guys later.